Hi, this is Lectures Around Town with Professor Joe, connecting global issues, environmental politics with what's happening here in the Twin Cities and along the Mississippi River. I wanted to talk to you all about a few of the key themes that we're going to be using to organize class this year in Political Science 160. Now that's a class on global politics, and we're going to think about global politics on a local level. And I thought that one place to begin that discussion and to look at one of the themes that we're going to look at this year would be to come down to the 3rd Precinct site that you're, I'm sure, familiar with. It's very close to Augsburg. I pass by here on a pretty much daily basis on my way to campus. You can see the building in the back here, and some of the murals behind me here that were put up after the protests and the confrontations here that led to the closing of this station, right? And this, to me, brings to mind one of the key themes that we'll look at this year, which is the process of contesting control over land. How it is that particular powers, forces can come to take control over a piece of real estate, over a chunk of the territory, and then use that power to extract resources, to exert control and domination over that area. Now, I'm standing on what was traditionally Dakota homeland here, now called Minneapolis, and it was taken by force, really, through deceit, through manipulation, through military conquest, and we'll look at some other sites related to that. But this question of who controls what land and how do they exercise that control is one of the issues we'll be looking at, and it was one that was right at the forefront of these struggles when people, citizens, protesters, question in a fundamental way the legitimacy and the authority of the police force here in this building behind me. And that building is now empty, and it's unclear whether that will be occupied again. You can see that the flag there behind me is a symbol of that authority, right? Saying that this is part of a particular political organization, right? The United States of America, that is considered the sovereign power, the ultimate authority in this part of the world. And other governments obviously assert claims to sovereignty in different parts of the world, and people challenge those claims. And so we'll talk about how it is that those claims are made, how they're upheld, what is the basis for those claims, and also how those claims are constantly being contested and challenged in various ways. And that's certainly the case right here in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and right here at the 3rd Precinct. So you can see this set of dormitories or residences was actually used during World War II for housing folks who were Japanese American and able to work on translating messages, intercepted messages during World War II. So some global connections there. And then the fort, flag not flying there currently, the fort is closed. And this was just another very clear sign of the nature of sovereignty and land claims here, that in some level is always rooted in military force and conquest, with the fort being just a very clear manifestation of that. today that function is carried out primarily by the police, sometimes by National Guard, as we saw last summer. And you can see that some of that included, as noted on this sign here, some executions. This included a few of the Dakota who were captured in the War of 1862, held captive here. This is of Sakpedan and Wakanazhazan, who were brought back from Canada and executed here in 1865. So these questions about sovereignty, about police power, about control and violence are manifest here at Fort Snelling, and they shape global politics all around in various countries, in all countries. So I'm down here by the Mississippi River in the gorge, as it's called, that runs from St. Anthony Falls down pretty much to Fort Snelling. I'll be going down there in a little bit and talk more about that, but I wanted to use this as a backdrop for talking about another key theme in Paul 160, and that is globalization and our local connections to global issues. It's a key theme. It's maybe a bit of a cliche, but it's something that we're going to look at in more detail and really try and get our heads around what does it mean to be so globally interconnected. Now, in the age of COVID, that may seem patently obvious, right? Here's a disease that's spread around the globe. It's connecting and affecting all of us in profound ways. In fact, that I'm talking to you on this video being one of them. But I like to think of the river as a nice metaphor and a site for thinking about our global interconnections, because the river is it's a connecting feature, right? Rivers connect from upstream to downstream. They connect from the watershed, all the water that falls in 2/3 of the continental United States flows eventually into the Mississippi River and makes its way to the Gulf of Mexico. So it's obviously something that connects us in very powerful, very real ways. What happens in one part of the watershed affects people in other parts of the watershed. So same with all sorts of other global dynamics. And those global dynamics show up here on the Mississippi as well. So one of those would be climate change, right? So the fact that we've got more carbon dioxide up in the air there, warming things up, heating up the atmosphere, there's more energy trapped in the Earth's atmosphere, more and more every day. Pretty steady trend there. And the science is showing us more and more clearly that that's having an impact, and that shows up on the Mississippi River with more intense, more prolonged flooding events. So we get a lot more flooding at odd times of the year. We've had flooding, normally it just happens in the spring. Normally it's not too bad. Now we're getting these floods that are supposed to only come around every 100 years, and they're happening every 3 or 4 years. We're getting floods that used to be much more rare, much less common. So climate change is having an impact here, heating up the atmosphere, putting more moisture in the atmosphere. I can feel it today. It's another hot, muggy day. Maybe you can hear the cicadas humming away there, a sign of the heat of this late summer afternoon. So climate change affects us. The pollution issues in the watershed affect us. Also trade, which flows up and down the Mississippi River. Right here we are at the head of navigation. From here south, the Mississippi River carries millions of tons of cargo, mostly corn and soybeans, but also oil and chemicals and salt and cement and all sorts of things that go down to eventually a lot of it ends up in the port of New Orleans, which is the busiest port in the Western Hemisphere, and from there it goes out into the global market and vice versa, imports coming in. So trade climate change, the spread of viruses, pandemics, also obviously migration as a huge force, politically controversial in this current era, with debates about that, and the Trump administration really cracking down on immigration and using fear of foreigners as a key part of their political message. So migration would be yet another manifestation of these global interconnections. So that's part of what we'll be talking about in the semester this year, is how it is that what happens around the globe affects us here, and how what we do here has an impact around the globe as well. So I'm here at another site in Minneapolis. This is near Minnehaha Falls. This is a statue here of Colonel John H. Stevens, known here as the first settler in Minneapolis. And behind him is his house. This was the original house, the first European residence here on the west bank of the Mississippi at St. Anthony Falls. Here's my bike. And this was known as the ferry station. He was given the land in 1850 by the military, by the U.S. military, as part of what we know of as settler colonialism. And in exchange for that, he provided service ferrying people across the river there, just around, I think it would have been just below St. Anthony Falls, I guess. So anyhow, this is the original house, then moved. There you can see the little outhouse. But part of what I want to do here is use this as a backdrop for thinking about another theme that we'll talk about, and that is cultural differences between different countries around the globe. That's an important part of world politics. And obviously our own history as a country that was part of settler colonial practices, and obviously included slavery and the long legacies of racism and segregation in this country. And part of that is manifested now in this other phenomenon that's obviously not new to today, but has been heightened, and we're seeing more of it these days, and that is some of these informal settlements and camps that have sprung up in a lot of parks and other green spaces around the Twin Cities. This is one that's been here for a couple months now. A few have been taken down, but there's still a lot of people living out here. And this gets to this issue of housing and homelessness, and how different countries, have issues with this, and how they respond to it. And it brings to mind for me some of the differences socially in terms of social policy, and whether we think of housing as a right or something that has to be somehow earned, and how do we respond in times of crisis with COVID and the racial justice issues, when we've had a big upsurge in the houseless population, both in the Twin Cities and just really around the country. What are our collective obligations to respond to that? Is it something that's to be dealt with by government, by nonprofits, by people self-organizing, by individual action? Is it my problem or not? Is it any of our problems? So that's another key theme we'll look at, just is how different countries develop, obviously different cultures, different value systems, and how that's reflected in social policy and practices around many, many issues, including housing and homelessness. Well, I'm standing here at a restored prairie in South Minneapolis at a site that's called Coldwater Spring. It was originally a site of sacred site, a meeting place for the Dakota and other indigenous people here. There's a spring, freshwater spring, that flows by just a little bit down from here. It is still a sacred site for the Dakota people, and a gathering spot for people who come to honor that place and just get some quiet reflection. This was used during construction of Fort Snelling, and then it was eventually turned into land for the U.S. Bureau of Mines, and they had research and other facilities here related to mining, particularly the iron ore mining up in northern Minnesota. And then that shut down, and there were various other plans and protests and discussions, and it was eventually turned over to the Park Service, and they're the ones that have been restoring this prairie to what it was. And part of why I've stopped here is because some of the big historical trends and changes that we experience over the course of human history, this site has gone through some big changes from originally a native prairie, an indigenous meeting place, a sacred site, to a place that focused on the use of land here for extractive heavy industry, the mining, and then now to a publicly owned space that's run by the government and used for historical interpretation, natural preservation, and open to the general public. And in our course, we will be looking at a bunch of these big historical trends. I enjoy studying those because it helps me understand kind of where we've been, where we're at, where we're heading as a species, where are we heading on this planet. And one of the books you're reading by Yuval Harari, called Sapiens, does a grand tour of human history, all of human history. And he talks about a lot of big changes and trends over time. He talks in particular about three big changes, three revolutions that we'll talk about. One, the cognitive revolution, this rise of a certain human capacity to communicate and work together that is such a central aspect of our nature and our what distinguishes us from other primates. And he talks about the agricultural revolution, how spaces that were like this sort of prairie, were turned into the massive industrial agricultural monocrop farming of corn and soybeans and all the other agricultural production that we've seen. And third, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of modern industry that came out of scientific revolution and all the changes that brought about. And this video that I'm making and the kind of communication we're doing now is part of a fourth revolution that we're in the midst of, and that is that digital revolution, this a new wave of increasing human power to communicate, to connect, to create new forms of intelligence, new, almost some would say even on the verge of creating new forms of life, artificial life. So we'll talk about that, what that means for our lives, what it means for our day-to-day interactions as global citizens, and how we can use that bigger context to help us navigate the challenges such as COVID-19, the economic crisis, the racial justice issues that we're in the midst of. That concludes this lecture around town. Thanks for watching. I look forward to talking about all these issues and many more over the course of the semester with you all. See you soon.